Will Donald Trump order B-2 bombers equipped with advanced bunker-busting bombs to take out Iran's nuclear weapons facilities buried deep underground beneath the mountains of Fordo? Well, it looks like we are going to be waiting a little bit longer to find out. Hours ago, the president's spokeswoman, Karoline Leavitt, said there was now going to be a 2-week deadline, allowing Iran to decide whether to come back to the negotiating table. Have a look.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president.
2 weeks. I don't know who's going to be left to negotiate by then, but the word is that the Trump White House is still trying to weigh up all the different factors when it comes to that B-2 strike. What could go wrong? What might come next? And will an American action possibly make things worse? If I say if, this is the thought process that is going on in the White House, well, you know what? I think that's probably not a bad thing. There's a lot of hot rhetoric around this right now, and Donald Trump should not be allowed to be baited into action, but instead think long and hard about what happens if the U.S. jumps in, what the consequences might be, and again, that all-important question with every Middle Eastern endeavor, what comes next? Because personally, I think that for far too long now, this whole debate has been boiled down to a simplistic binary, and particularly over the past few days in particular. You know, yes, no, black, white. But this sort of thinking in this sort of situation is not helpful. Not when there are so many other possibilities in the cards. What something else could happen? Will the Iranian regime of Ayatollah Khamenei collapse of its own accord? Could it surrender? Will the mullahs decide to flee to some other country like maybe Russia? Or will they be deposed like, say, the dictators of Eastern Europe were at the end of the Cold War? Will they come, though, as Trump suggests, to the negotiating table and agree to demands they drop their nuclear weapons program and be allowed to keep control of Iran? And, of course, there is the biggest question of all. If they go, who would take over, either by force or of their own volition? Now, I ask all these questions for a very simple reason. I want to make the point that the whole will he or won't he do it question is so much more complicated than pretty much everyone in the media has been portraying it. And in fact, if you ask me, a lot of people both outside and in the Republican Party or its various factions have been using the question as a way to split the right. I mean, ask yourself this. Over the past few days, how many articles have you seen in the news, pieces on TV, especially in anti-Trump newspapers and news outlets, gleefully talking up division between MAGA Republicans on one side and other conservative or neocon Republicans on the other? Well, probably quite a few, because, of course, this is not helpful. So allow me to suggest this instead. Reports of a conservative MAGA split have been at least somewhat exaggerated. Basically, and here's a quick summary, the MAGA wing of the party, the hardest of the hardcore Trumpers, are saying to the president, don't do it. We do not want to be involved in any foreign conflict. We elected you, Mr. President, on a promise that there would be no more boots on the ground in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. And the MAGA crew, they have a point. I mean, the post-9/11 invasion of Iraq, well, we know that was based on a lie. Saddam Hussein didn't have WMDs, he certainly didn't do the attacks, and the occupation of the country was botched from the get-go because, contrary to the assertions of some in the Bush administration, we were not welcomed as liberators. And of course, we all know what happened, and I get why people in this camp are feeling like they're a bit burnt by all of that experience. Meanwhile, more traditional Republicans, conservatives, and the dreaded neocons, well, they have a different view. The dispute was sort of encapsulated this week by a verbal punch-up between Senator Ted Cruz and podcast host Tucker Carlson. Now, here's a bit of what went down as Ted and Tucker went head-to-head about whether Tucker's mind change on Iraq, which he supported at the time, has made him too timid about using American force today.
Look, I will say this, and look, I believe you're sincere.
Yeah.
But
I'm not God. I'm just some guy watching, trying to figure out the right thing for America.
And I think because you believe you were mistaken, and I agree previously, I think you've overcorrected.
What do you mean overcorrected? I'm worried about turning this mess in Iran into a much larger mess. That's the concern.
And by the way, that's a reasonable worry. Look,
I know it's reasonable.
But the whole thing descended into farce when the two men got into a fight over, of all things, the size of Iran's population.
Okay, so you topple the regime and by whatever means. What happens then? How many people live in Iran, by the way?
I don't know the population.
At all?
No, I don't know the population.
You don't know the population of the country you seek to topple?
How many people live in Iran?
92 million.
Okay. Yeah,
How could you not know that?
I don't sit around memorizing population tables.
Really? Seriously? This is what we're fighting about? Stupid debating points about Iran's population size? Look, this is all too important for dumb gotchas like that. So, let me jump into all of this and suggest that there is a way that we can square the circle here. Yes, there are a lot of war cheerleaders out there on one side, and frankly, some, but not all of those on the anti-war right, well, they've got some odd ideas too. Some of them about Israel that might be more at home at, Harvard, if you get my drift. But the polls are divided, though this New York Post polling suggests that actually MAGA may be more okay with strikes on Iran than perhaps that Tucker exchange suggested. And personally, I think that's right, because here's the thing. If you are truly about America first, that does not mean that you never use American power, particularly against a state like Iran. Now, putting aside Israel's war with Iran going on right now, the fact is the Iranian Islamic regime is a nation that from its very inception at its revolution has been at war with America. Storming the American embassy in 1979 and holding 66 American hostages for 444 days. In the years since that, there have been countless attacks on Americans, both civilian and military. Iran has also conducted targeted assassinations and even, yes, tried to kill President Donald Trump. And Newsweek fact-checked this, so you know it's true. Now, to my way of thinking, if you are America first, well, these guys in Tehran, they're not your friend. But let me also add a little wrinkle to this, because there's that whole question of what comes next that I mentioned a few moments ago. I mean, we want to know, will the regime collapse of its own accord? This is important. Now, a little while ago, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi of the Iranian royal family that was deposed in the revolution, well, he was on Fox, and here's what he had to say, and it was pretty interesting.
The latest report that we have had, Martha, is that the control apparatus of the regime is almost collapsing. And we see more and more of that reports that are coming to us from personnel within the military or intelligence that says so, that it's really falling apart much faster than it was, let's say, last week. And hopefully, at some point, the world will say, now it's time for us to step in and allow for this process to take its natural course, help the Iranian people overcome this regime.
So there's that possibility again that maybe in this 2 weeks something else happens in Tehran and the question of bombing Fordo becomes moot. But Pahlavi also said that he hoped that it didn't come to Trump having to bomb Iran, and he hoped that there was enough damage done to the regime without having to take it to that next level. And in doing so, he offered himself up as a figure who could help the nation emerge from the crisis.
I don't think I need a title to perform as a transitional leader. I think the reason people are looking for me to play that role is because of their confidence in me, their trust in me, and I think to a great extent the track record that I've demonstrated in the past 44 years since I began. And that trust in me allows me to play that national leader role, if you will, and be able to be the element that assembles people together on a common agenda, knowing that we might differ in opinion, but we are committed to the democratic outcome.
Fascinating stuff, and I'd rather him than any Ayatollah running the show in Tehran. But anyway, look, let's get on with the show, but I think that whether or not Trump decides to bomb Fordo, one thing remains absolutely clear, and that is whether you're MAGA America First or a Ted Cruz neocon, the Iranian regime must fall, whether under its own weight or because it was given a good old push. Because think about what happens if they survive. If the mullahs are allowed to continue their reign of terror and oppression, even without nuclear weapons, they will still be able to say to the world, look, we stood up to the little Satan, that's Israel. We stood up to the great Satan, that's the United States. And they backed down, they will say, while saying that we survived. We are the future. The United States, Israel, Western civilization, well, they're yesterday's news. And that, my friends, is why, whether you are MAGA or neocon, well, that is bad news for America and her allies.